28 Australia New Zealand podcast episode. I'm Sarah Fieschi, founder of Food Spirit Wellness and assistant instructor for 28 Australia New Zealand. Today, I'm joined by Belinda Fettke, who has spent over a decade diligently exploring and challenging ideas in nutrition and health that many of us have long accepted as fact. Belinda, it's wonderful to have you here with us. Could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and what you most want people to understand about your work?
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Sarah. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited to share some of my research with your listeners and your students and your peers. I think probably the most important thing is I would like to do a disclaimer right at the very outset. I'm not anti-vegetarian, anti-vegan, anti-religion. This is purely research that I've done, falling down rabbit holes that I never expected to go down. I think it's really important to respect cultural, religious, and ethical beliefs. But as I've discovered, when those beliefs and ideologies come into dietary guidelines and create, regulation against doctors and health practitioners who are talking about the health benefits of animal proteins and fats and reducing processed carbohydrates and sugars out of our diet, when they're not allowed to talk about those things, then I think that's not fair. So I think it's respect both ways. And so my research has delved into the demonization of saturated fat in particular. And it was something I never thought I'd be doing. And it started with my husband's journey. So at the time, I was a very busy photographer, weddings, portraits. I didn't have a lot of time. And I knew what he was talking about. I knew he was getting very excited. He had managed to improve his own health markedly, Sarah. Like, he reversed his prediabetes, gastrointestinal reflux. He lost a lot of weight, but he also put his cancer into remission. And again, another disclaimer, his particular cancer was very aggressive, but not malignant in the fact that it couldn't metastasize. So after surgeries, radiotherapy, 11 and a half years of chemo, the only thing that actually held his cancer or put it into remission was diet in the end. I'm not saying those other things weren't important at the time, but diet was massive. And in hindsight and looking forward, nutrition is an adjunct to any cancer therapy. It really should be considered in that way. And in particular, if you think about cancer cells, they're put into a petri dish and fed with glucose to grow so we can work out how to kill them. So what if we don't feed them the glucose in the first place? So this is where Gary's journey has come from. So it's been a remarkable health journey for him. Like, he's had cancer for 25 years, 26 years this year. Yeah, here he is, still fighting a good fight, still challenging public health narratives, still making changes. He and a group of people managed to get the diabetes guidelines changed to include low carbohydrate as a healthy option and a safe option for people who choose it and for those practitioners who can assist them. So he's still working really, really hard on all this space. But at the time when he first started talking about it, I was aware, but I was busy with my own things. And all of a sudden, Sarah, like, Gary was reported to the medical board by a dietitian at his hospital for recommending his patient reduce sugar. Now, if you think about hospital menus, they advocate 3 desserts per day still in Tasmania, in public hospitals, for people with type 2 diabetes. These are people with out of control blood glucose levels. And after Gary had worked out that sugar was really integral in improving his health outcomes, he started saying it to his patients. He was amputating or debriding bits of rotting flesh, amputating toes, forefoot, feet, and even lower legs every single week in northern Tasmania in 2016. It was a tsunami. He just said, this is overwhelming. I did not go into medicine to cause harm. I came in to make people better. And when you have a trauma surgery or something, you see people get better and walk out. But with type 2 diabetes, which was considered a chronic progressive disease for so long, that's what we've been told in medical education, and to think that nutrition reducing sugar and processed carbohydrates can actually put it into remission or reverse type 2 diabetes, Gary just said, I can't be silent. So when he was reported, he went, this is ridiculous. The medical board's going to throw this out in a minute. But no, they didn't. And understanding why they didn't became part of my thing. I was watching Gary and other health advocates talk at Low Carb Down Under about the physiology, the biochemistry, all of the things that you need to improve metabolic health. And here was the medical board saying, you can't talk about it. He was getting targeted by all sorts of people, including the Dietitians Association of Australia. So I just put some of my photography on hold. I thought, this man, we've been going out since I was 16. I didn't make an adult decision without him. And here he was getting unfairly targeted and being told that he would have his medical license taken away. For sugar. And then it became about the processed carbs. And over the 2.5 years, he was reported again for inappropriately reversing someone's type 2 diabetes on national television. And then he was literally threatened. So 2.5 years of star chamber. We couldn't even have a lawyer. It was just ridiculous, Sarah. So I started doing research and I thought, I'll start a website. I support Gary. And it was incredible. People on social media got behind us. They were writing to the medical board saying, what are you doing? Why are you stopping a doctor from improving people's health outcomes? And so then I just started doing more and more research. It started off as a place of protection, and I understood that, I was quite shy once upon a time, you wouldn't believe it now, but I couldn't just stand beside Gary. I had to stand in front. I had to use my voice to give him his back. So that's where it came from. But as time went on, and certainly over the last 10 years, and he was exonerated after 4.5 years, I just have found the whole research fascinating. It's like anthropology, it's history, it's just so many factors all put together. As you mentioned earlier, who decides what we eat, when we eat, and why? And yeah, so that's my story in a nutshell, and that's where I've come from and where I'm going.
Thank you for sharing that journey with us, Belinda, to set the scene in terms of, well, what your work is all about now, and what preceded that. Really interesting. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper here in terms of what do you feel with the experience that you had alongside your husband, Dr. Gary Fettke? What did you learn from that experience most? What surprised you? What maybe didn't surprise you? What made you feel like you needed to, more than wanted to, you needed to keep digging deeper? Because you've already uncovered a bit with your intro here in terms of, well, why would a doctor be stopped? And, really the clamps put on the doctor when sharing information that is helpful for, for well-being, particularly for patients who are experiencing a fair amount of dysregulation. So what did you learn most? And then what made you want to keep going to dig deeper because something didn't feel right?
What I learned most, I just started by looking at the dietary guidelines and going back 100 years. And in the 1940s, meat and dairy were essential on the guidelines all around the Western world. And as time went on, I realized, well, certainly Gary and I were looking at the dietary guidelines in 2014, and we both went, where did the meat go? So we thought originally, and I certainly thought, he was in trouble for talking about sugar, and Coca-Cola came after him. But we thought he was in trouble for talking about sugar and processed foods because the vested interests that make money from this processed, well, it's not really food, is it? There's not a lot of nutrient in it. The processed food industry makes so much money. And so I just instantly thought it was just purely that. It was just purely a financial decision. And I guess the thing that surprised me the most was understanding that there's also a lot of religious ideology, which has a commercial backing as well. Again, very weird. And it was the expert witness was brought into Gary's case. And when I started to look, I even wrote to this man. I wrote to every address I could find at Deakin University, Monash University, in Taiwan, everywhere. and just said, I think if you spoke to Gary, you would have a lot in common because they were both very anti-smoking. And Gary worked out very early on that smoking did similar things to sugar, vasoconstricted extremities. So it wasn't good for him. If anyone was having an elective surgery, he made them stop smoking for 6 weeks. Of course, accidents different, but for elective surgeries. And this guy, Mark Walquist, was also very, very outspoken about the harms of cigarettes. So I thought, well, you've got some things in common. Maybe you have a chat to Gary. You're the biggest gun in nutrition in Southeast Asia Pacific region. Why don't you get together and have a bit of a chat? But he didn't answer anything. And so then I went, maybe he works for the sugar industry. So I couldn't help myself. I thought, right, you won't answer. I'm doing a deep dive. And in that deep dive, I discovered he was working for Sanitarium. And not just working for Sanitarium, he was the head of the Australasian Nutrition Advisory Council, convened totally under the copyright of Sanitarium. It sounded like a very efficient, very important group of people who were the people that the media would go to ask questions about red meat causes cancer, all these things. And I went, Sanitarium in my head, because I live in Tassie now, but I grew up in Sydney, not far from the Sydney Adventist Hospital. And I thought, they're vegetarian. Why are they vegetarian? No, just all these little questions started to click. And I will just say quickly, I was a nurse in my past life, which didn't mean I was born again. It just meant in my younger days, because someone actually asked if I think I'd been reincarnated. So in my past life, I was a nurse. And I didn't go to uni. This is back in the day when we trained on the hospital ward, wore the nurse's cap, the whole thing. So I was never in a university situation where I was taught education in a silo. And I believe that's what medicine is now, and dietetics. They silo it so you don't actually realize all the pieces connect. You don't look at the importance of animal proteins and fats because all they do is talk about plants. We look at textbooks and go, where is the meat in this dietetic textbook? And so they mention, oh, it's got some health properties, but then there's the rest of the book is plants. So it's very, very interesting. And I thought, Sanitarium is plants. So then I went down bizarrely, started looking into this space. And I'm going to take you down a very unexpected historical venture, I guess, and talk about the temperance movement, which you probably think, what on earth has this got to do with what we eat today? But I think it has a lot to do with it. And back in the 1800s, there were two movements happening at the same time. They had very different missions, but a lot of their ideas overlapped. And so we'll talk about the temperance movement first, because that is, people would understand about prohibition of alcohol and probably have heard that in America it was very, very big at the time. So by 1851, this is almost 200 years ago, 1851, the state of Maine already had prohibition and act enabled. So they were stopping people from drinking alcohol, from creating alcohol and making alcohol. And if you think about the Industrial Revolution, a lot of people were moving into the cities. Thin beer was probably the safest drink you could have. Even children drank it. It was a very low alcohol beer because they'd put it through the yeast process and gotten rid of the bacteria and the harmful things that were in the cholera was in the normal water supply. So it made sense, but they put a prohibition on and started to change this by 1851. It wasn't until, by 1886, sorry. So you had this movement. By 1886, something like 28 states had started to enact prohibition laws in America. And I think this is because people had moved into the cities. There were a lot of men there who weren't with their families. They were going to pubs to drink at night. And, it caused a lot of adultery. It was causing some domestic violence. It was causing criminal behavior. And it was also causing these men to maybe not operate the machinery as well as they could have once they moved into the cities. So there's a number of factors there, and I'm not going to judge anyone on all of those. But, there's a lot of states enacting prohibition before it became national law. And by 1886, someone very smart invented the soda fountain and the ice cream parlor. An ice cream sundae. It was something you could share with your family and have on a Sunday that wasn't in prohibition. But if you think about the soda fountains, that started with Coca-Cola. So we're talking about Coca-Cola syrup that actually had caffeine and cocaine in it, but it was allowed because it wasn't considered alcohol. So instead, we had a lot of people now consuming sugar, Sarah, sugar at levels. And you think, I'm jumping ahead just quickly to say, I'm putting this in the lens of Weston A. Price. By the 1930s, he was seeing a huge increase in tooth decay. And you think, this sugar started in 1886. It was being processed very cheaply because of industrialization. So a whole lot of factors all joined together. But Coca-Cola, 1886, that's when the soda fountain started. Now, 1863, we'll go down the other arm, 1863, there'd been a real movement called the Temperance Health Reform Movement. And this was really about religious purity. So it included no alcohol, but some of the temperance movement weren't looking at this purity in the same way. And it became about Western vegetarianism. And it started with Sylvester Graham and, Fruitlands with the Alcott brothers. And there's a whole lot of varying things. But by 1863, the prophetess of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they incorporated it in 1863. And that same year, she had a health reform vision. And her health reform vision was that the Garden of Eden diet in the Bible, fruits, nuts, and seeds, it wasn't even grains then, fruits, nuts, and seeds was the God-appointed diet of man. And flesh meat was a toxic stimulant that defiled not only men, but women and children. It went into the category with salts and peppers and spices and alcohol, obviously, and caffeine and tobacco. But she believed meat was the worst because it excited baser passions and it caused masturbation. So this temperance health reform movement was really anti-masturbation. It thought not only sinful to do that to yourself, but that it affected your relationship with God. Something in our day, we'd go, yeah, that was then. But these beliefs, the temperance movement with the prohibition, with bringing all that sugar into our diet, and then the temperance health reform movement birthed the Kellogg cereal company. So John Harvey Kellogg was only 12 years old when he went to work for the Seventh-day Adventist Church, or when he went to work for Ellen and her husband James, with this devout belief that flesh meat in particular would excite. And she made him, or he typeset her book, A Solemn Appeal to Mothers, and it spoke only of mothers deterring their children from masturbation. And this book included, don't sleep on a hard mattress, don't do this, don't do that. There's a few other things, but eating meat, food was the most concerning thing to her. She said in this book that if parents put meat in front of their children, don't expect your prayers to be answered. Now, this is a very religious time in America, a really powerful time when people are wanting to get to heaven. This is a 12-year-old boy typesetting a book, and all he read about was the evils of masturbating and the evils of flesh meat. And I say, is it any wonder, because they paid for his medical education, is it any wonder that when he became a doctor and superintendent of the church's Battle Creek Sanitarium, that he wanted to invent bland foods to take the place of flesh meat, eggs, milk, and butter? That's what he did. So that the legacy of the temperance health reform movement is cereals, soy meat, nut butters, everything that's not, all the fake dairy. That is that whole legacy, which has come through into sanitarium here in Australia. The church here has a very, very small footprint, but a massive physical presence without us even realizing. And we've spoke briefly on that, and I won't go into it right now, but people are welcome to look up a lot of my work and you'll see that. But if you think about it, this is what Weston A. Price was seeing. Processed grains, and also think about it, getting rid of those vitamins A, D, and K2, which were in animal proteins and fats, which he believed when he looked around in 1930, when he traveled the world and found pockets of isolated, self-sustaining communities. It didn't matter what that food was packaged up as. So the Inuit in Alaska, their A, D, and K2 were packaged completely differently to Indigenous Australians and South Pacific Islanders. But it was going out of the diet in America in the 1930s because of these convergence of the temperance health reform and temperance movements, which I don't think people have looked back at. This is when sugar and cereal, and also you've got Procter and Gamble introducing Crisco, trans fats. So, and that's 1910. So by 1930, you can understand people's teeth were rotting and their metabolic health was decreasing. So that's where I would like to lay that historical foundation as well.
Yeah, wow. Uh, uh, the information that you shared with us, Belinda, is a true testament of how deep you have been digging for quite
Yes.
some time to uncover the historical aspects of what we have seen, but also what we are now experiencing.
Yes.
And I guess the infiltration of religious ideologies, and that has then,
Yeah.
sort of brought in that plant-based messaging element that's being threaded throughout
Mm.
industries.
Yes.
And
Yes.
you
Yes,
meant,
the commercial arm, but yes, very, very much. So there was an article written. I spoke in Spain in 2018, and Gary also spoke about my research in America in 2018. And there was an article published by very, very high level Seventh-day Adventists in America, and it was called The Global Influence of the Seventh-day Adventist Church on Diet. On the back, because they even referenced my work in their listing of research at the bottom. So they were very aware of what I was talking about. And they are proud of the research they've done. They are proud of the influence, because even now they truly believe that animal proteins and fats, while might not necessarily talk about masturbation so much, they truly still believe that it defiles the body. Their prophetess told them this. And if you think about the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they have been integral to the Dietitians Association of Australia, to the founding of the American Dietetic Association. So Lena Frances Cooper, she was John Harvey Kellogg's protege at Battle Creek Sanitarium. She and 7 or 8 others co-founded the American Dietetic Association in 1917 with the belief that animal proteins and fats were bad. It had come down. She had been indoctrinated in her education to believe this. Not all of the dietitians who started the American Dietetic Association were of the same belief, but she wrote textbooks. She was highly influential. A lot of people would have looked to her as the expert. And I believe she was, and I haven't seen it written anywhere else either, that she was the very first industry dietitian. She started the American Dietetics Association as an industry dietitian because her cookbooks could only be followed if you bought John Harvey Kellogg's inventions. It was about making protos. It was about nutter. You had to include his inventions. So she was an industry dietitian. And she started the American Dietetics Association. So again, it's this plant-based messaging that's been coming through. It went away for a little while, and even Lena Frances Cooper said she had to learn how to do different cuts of meat. She had to learn how to prepare meat and do things, but she still, for her education, she had to go to Drexel for a little while, the institute, but then she came back. Her brothers were devout Seventh-day Adventist missionaries going all around the world with this idea. And so another thing that really hit home for me, and so I'll come forward, was when I was investigating Gary's case. I was typing a lot of things. I'm not very technical. I can't hack into back ends of systems or anything else. The Wayback Archive machine has been fantastic. And I was able to find out about a lot of things because the URLs stayed the same. And so I got a lot of information from there. But I uncovered documentation stating that the Dietitians Association of Australia was being paid $23,000 a year from the Australian Breakfast Cereal Manufacturers Forum. And part of that manufacturers forum was Sanitarium, Kellogg's, Freedom Foods, Nestle, and anyway, they were paying the dietitians $23,000 a year for 3 years to use their members to influence, protect, and actively defend cereal grains and sugars messaging. And that's when Gary was reported by a dietitian. I'm not blaming the dietitian. We've never named her, even though I worked out who she was, because APRA wasn't very good at hiding the information when we got it. They left all of her friends on the Facebook screen grabs. They took her name out, but they left her friends there, and I was able to work out who it was because it's a small community. But she was being educated. Like, this is the Dietitians Association that educates, that accredits and regulates dietetics. So if you're being told by your trusted association that covers all of those things that meat is bad and that plants are good, and there's nothing wrong with sugar, because you look at all the research the DAA kept putting out at the time, they've hidden most of it now, but it was all funded by the Sugar Research Foundation and Kellogg's and everybody else. But these groups were meeting every couple of months to determine about their cereal sales going down, and they named Gary as targeted for active defense in these documents that I uncovered from the ABCMF. It's like, I can't believe they're colluding. Like, if we'd known, we could have crowdsourced and gotten 30,000 for the DAA and said, hey, meat's good. Yeah, this is scary that they were bought out for $23,000, Sarah. $23,000. And what harm has that done? I'm not blaming individual dietitians, but that association, that institution has created indelible harm to people. And Gary talks about, we've talked about leprosy. And, these people, type 2 diabetes is modern day leprosy. And these people were losing flesh off their feet. They were losing legs, amputating, and DAA was doing nothing about it. They were prepared to cover it all up and silence the doctor. So this is why I got very, very loud. And this is why I kept looking into the plant-based messaging. In 2017, I reckon, because I was looking at the temperance movement and all these other things, that's when I came across Weston A. Price's work. And Sally Fallon Morrell, and I have spoken for the Weston A. Price Foundation in Melbourne in 2019. A phenomenal work going around, but working out that the communities that he uncovered around the world that had beautiful dental jaws, beautiful frames, very few dental caries, if any, and room for their wisdom teeth to grow, were all communities that had vitamins A, D, and K2. And I went through some of the graphs that he'd done. And because, in Australia, we're told over and over, and probably in New Zealand as well, over and over, that our Indigenous communities grew up on a low-fat diet. It was low-fat. They ate plants, they ate some animals, but kangaroos are lean meat and emus lean, and this is lean. Did you know that the vitamin K2 content in the tail of a kangaroo and the back of an emu is 12 to 15 times higher than the vitamin K2 in any other fat? They were eating liquid gold. They didn't need to have a fatty animal because they still had that same packaged amount of fat that was necessary compared to the Inuit eating blubber. It's how it was packaged. And so we've been falsely told that our Indigenous communities ate a low-fat diet, but they didn't. It was just packaged differently. So that made me very aware of what was going on with the blue zones. And I will also say, my darling husband, he asked me to make him a map of the blue zones when he first started talking in 2012. I was a photographer. I was able to create a map for him for his slides. Oh, the blue zones. He saw the blue zones through Weston A. Price's eyes. He saw the blue zones as communities that were thriving on generations of wisdom of how to prepare animal fats, how to preserve the meats, how to look after themselves, but also when they made their breads and they made other things, certainly in Costa Rica, the nixtamalization, how to get nice and out of corn and not make it toxic. They had this incredible knowledge they were passing down. So what they were eating gave them health and strength. And so that was Gary's talk. And then all of a sudden I said to him, you do realize one of the places in the blue zones is a Seventh-day Adventist enclave that only ate plants. And he said to me, what? And I said, yes. So that then piqued my interest in the blue zones. So it was about 2015, I think I was really starting to look at it, but then Weston A. Price's work a bit later. And I just went, why is Loma Linda there? In 2019, I spoke in America about the blue zones with the knowledge that I had then, and especially because an Australian academic called Saul Newman had just done a pre-publication of challenging the blue zones birth certificates and were they really that age? Were they really super centenarians? Were they centenarians? And his work is justified in a lot of cases. I think in 2010, Japan put out a headline saying 230,000 centenarians were missing. In other words, their families were still collecting their pensions, but these people had passed. So there is a lot of questions around some of those. And also you're relying on families creating these documentation and whatever. But if you look beyond that and look to see what those isolated, self-sustaining pockets of communities were doing, that whether they were 100 or 110, or whether they were only 90, they were exceptionally healthy. And so I decided to let the birth certificates go out the door for a little while, and I just look at what they were doing through the lens of Weston A. Price. And I realized that Dan Buettner, so the original area in Sardinia, that's the very, very first one that was identified by Giovanni Pes in 1996. He presented it in 1999, and Belgian demographer Michel Paula came in to do the work with him. He said, I don't believe it. It must be a gene, because these people are so isolated up in the mountains, 6,000 to 9,000 meters above sea level in Sardinia. And he said, I'm going to come and age validate, and let's just really look at this group. And they thought they would find a gene modification because they'd been isolated for so long. But as they looked, they realized it was place. It was the environment. It was what they ate. It was how they lived. It was their close-knit community. And in Sardinia in particular, there's only a small pocket now, but when these people would have been growing up, there's a system called a Dempravi, which is where the whole community supports each other. So the men would go off shepherding for 6 months of the year. They'd go down and collect some supplies. They'd come back. The women, even though it's very confrontational to talk about that in our society, there were specific gender roles. That was how the community worked together to create this ability to have all this wisdom. The women went through menopause so they could be the grandmothers, and they could teach the cooking, and they could help the mothers. They could look after the children. Like, it was part of nature. The only two species that go through menopause are humans and whales. And whales, again, do that same thing. They're the grandmother. They look after the pods, and they remember when there were periods of scarceness. They knew where to take the pod of whales to find food that maybe the younger ones didn't know about. So I think we minimize the importance of generational wisdom in our society as we separate more and more. And that's what Weston A. Price found, and that's what each of these blue zones, I believe the ancestral ones, really relied on. The recipes, the closeness, the care, and apparently there is a bit of criminal behavior and whatever else, a bit of, your family did that to my family, whatever. But in general, this is where we're going. And so I looked at Sardinia, and that's how the blue zone was identified. They marked this tiny area in the mountains and realized with this blue highlighter pen, it became a blue zone. At the same time, Western attention was being focused on Makoto Suzuki's work in Okinawa. So by 2004, he was really highlighting people. He'd moved there in 1976 to start to study for the Tokyo University as a geriatrician, and couldn't believe the age of these people and their health status of Okinawans in general. It's just mind blown. And in fairness, this is his honest belief. He was being shown birth and death certificates and not questioning them. But if you look at the history of Okinawa, which is fascinating, it was originally the Ryukyu Kingdom. It was independent. But because they could grow sugar on it, the Chinese decided they would pay them to grow sugarcane, and they introduced the Agu pig. They also then told the Ryukyus that they weren't allowed to eat the horse or the cow, because again, Okinawa is an unusual Asian country. There's no Buddhism. There was no taboos against meat, what they could and couldn't eat. So it is different. They also had goats, and one of the few Asian countries that lived on goat's milk. So again, I think Weston A. Price is AD and vitamin K2 from animal proteins and fats. And so when they introduced the pig and they told them they weren't allowed to eat their horse and cow, pig became the major protein source for these people in Okinawa. Even though they're surrounded by water, I'm not saying they didn't fish, I'm not saying they didn't eat seaweed and other things, but pig was essential. And it had also been in Sardinia. And so then the battle of in the war, the Battle of Okinawa in 1945 was the most horrific casualty program of the entire war. And 1/3 of Okinawan civilians were killed. 1/3 of their civilians. They lost 90% of their buildings, and the American occupation lasted from 1945 to 1972. And during that time, the American government was doing a lot of investigating to look out for people. And so in 1949, they did a survey, because if you think about 90% of those buildings were destroyed, in Okinawa, they had handwritten birth, death, and marriage certificates. So 90% of those were destroyed. So potentially, Motoko Suzuki was looking at rewritten, and the Americans rewrote them. Now, I am not blaming a single person. If 1/3 of the civilization was killed, civilian population, you lost your family, you lost your work, you lost everything. Would you not say you were older so you could get a pension? Get a pension over 60. I mean, why not? In 1980 in Okinawa, they had the highest longevity. The population was the oldest living in Japan. But by 2005, it was decimated. So that's those people who potentially added on some extra years. They had nothing. And the American government also interviewed them. So apparently the crops were terrible. They had, I think, 100,000 pigs on Okinawa. By the end of the war, there was 800. So that's a lot more than 1/3. So we've got 2/3 of the civilian population to eat a very small amount of pig now. So when they interviewed them, and they made notes in their documents to say that these people were on harsh rations even by 1949. There just wasn't enough food to really feed them well. And so they introduced spam, packaged tinned meat, tinned pork, and it is now a delicacy in Okinawa. They loved it so much, even though their pig population has built up. So I guess what I'm trying to say is this image that we've got of these places that are plant-based, in fact, the Blue Zone pamphlet says it's 95 to 100% plants. When the government interviewed Okinawans in 1949, which Dan Buttner references, and I'll get onto him in a second, in 1949, when they asked these people what they ate, is it any wonder they say they ate sweet potato for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Because sweet potato survived the war. It survived the 2 typhoons that happened after the war before 1949. It was a root vegetable that they could access, and it grew easily. That does not mean that's what they ate before the war, and it does not mean that's what they ate after the war. But that's, we've got this idea that they eat sweet potatoes all the time. They do love sweet potato, but they don't eat it. Separate to a lot of pork and a lot of lard. And I think also Weston A. Price talked about this, the importance of these ancestral communities as I go through, which I'm not doing as well as I should, is this importance of pork, pig. Do you can, as a shepherd, you can take your goats and sheep and you can get a lot of other things you can get wool, and you can get, you can trade all sorts of things from those other animals, and you can grow bigger herds. But a pig is kept as something that can't be taxed by the government. In the backyard, you can feed it scraps. When you kill it, 20 litres of lard. That will preserve meat, and that will provide cooking for an entire family, if not many families, for a year. So you've got the meat, but you've got this fat. And I think lard for cooking in Okinawa, in Sardinia, in Nicoya, and Costa Rica is vitally important to that discussion. Completely banned in Loma Linda. It's unclean, but we'll get to that. So Okinawa was being looked at. Dan Buttner pitched to National Geographic, said, hey, can I come and find the secrets to long life? We've got this group in Okinawa. I'm hearing about Sardinia. How awesome would it be? He says that his editor wanted a place that was also in America. So for some reason, he said he doesn't know how it happened. He said he probably should have dropped it when he looked at it later, because the validation of the age of the centenarians didn't match these ancestral ones. And again, I'll come to that later. But Loma Linda became the third blue zone. And in 2005, it came out as a National Geographic front cover and launched books, recipes, all sorts of things from that. In 2005, Dan Buettner trademarked the blue zones in America. Michel Poulet and Giovanni Pesce said they didn't know he did that. So he's trademarked blue zones as a copyrighted thing that he can then franchise. He can make money from. They apparently were involved in it later, but at the time, Michel Poulet said he didn't know he'd done it. Over the next couple of years, they also identified Nicoya in Costa Rica and Icaria in Greece. Again, Nicoya has a fascinating history. Weston A. Price, Sally Fallon-Morell, she's done this amazing articles on the fallacy of Costa Rica and Nicoya in particular being a blue zone, and it's well worth reading. But again, yes, they ate corn and squash and they ate all those things, the three sisters, but they cooked it in lard. They knew how to prepare these foods that have been there for 6,000 years on this peninsula. They were cattle farmers. They ate animal protein. In fact, when I've seen some other interviews where people said they hunted wild pig, they hunted all sorts of animals. So they ate turtles and turtle eggs. So it's not a plant-based diet, even though they try to intimate it is. But Icaria is really interesting. So Icaria, in the Mediterranean, a tiny rocky island, only 8,000 people, 35,000 goats currently. Now, is Dan Buettner really trying to tell me that these people eat plants only? 95%, 100% plants? 35,000 goats. That's another story about how they've become so many, and it's all about EU giving them money to have more goats and then not allowing them to slaughter them on the island, and these people are too poor to send them away to a proper slaughterhouse, and now it's decimating, the goats are decimating the island. So it's very distressing when you read into all of that. But these people growing up in this time when they would have been centenarians, when they were discovered in 2007, 2008. So again, it's 20 years ago, and there aren't very many people left, if any. Well, certainly none of the centenarians, but there aren't many elders either. And in Icaria, it's probably the only place that you could honestly say they don't eat a lot of meat. And the reason you can say that, so in Sardinia, they're Catholics, and so they fast for Lent, and they fast from meat on Wednesdays and Fridays, and that's warm-blooded animals. But they can still eat fish. They can eat cold-blooded animals for fish. So the religious restrictions and observances don't take away the ability for people to eat animal proteins and fats. But in Icaria, in Greek Orthodox, even though it's right in the middle of the Mediterranean, plumb smack there, their religious observances are actually about blue blood or red blood. They're not allowed to eat red-blooded animals. That even includes fish. And it's 120 to 180 days a year. So if you go and visit during these extended periods of fasting, you could potentially say they only eat plants. But what hasn't been discussed in this conversation is blue blood. So hemoglobin is based on, it's a heme ion that takes the oxygen around for vertebrates. But hemocyanin is blue blood. And when the original canons would have been written for the religious texts, people would have thought some specific animals, including squid, mussels, snails, snakes, octopi, had no blood. So these things were allowed to be eaten. So even though it says no fish, they couldn't eat because they had red blood, it bled, but they could eat other things. And in Icaria, again, during occupation, during war, and for all its history, it didn't have a lot of resources like Sardinia, where people conquered and took over the fertile plains. It is a rocky island, but a lot of pirates. And so they would pick their times to go down to the ocean. They apparently reserved fish for funerals. So we're talking about a group of people that mostly lived inland on this rocky island, and snails are abundant. Now, snails are a protein. They were allowed to eat snails 24/7 all the way through this religious fasting period, which again doesn't get discussed. They eat more snails than the French. So it just started making my mind question. They have this long fasting period, but when they feast, they eat pig for Christmas. Again, the lard is used. They don't eat it all year round because there's times when they're fasting and observing. But over the course of the year, they are eating enough vitamin A, D, and K2 to keep them incredibly healthy. And another thing that's ignored in Dan Buettner's Blue Zone thing is the smoking and the drinking. And it's not good public health messaging. But these people are making their own cigarettes. They're making their own wines. They're incredibly strong, some of them. In Ikaria, it's 18% wine. And I read a very funny article where this guy said, of course, we don't drink before 10 in the morning. So we don't start drinking at 10 like we do in other ones on any of the months that don't have an R in them, because that's the middle of summer. If they started drinking at 10, 18% wine, they'd get nothing done all day. I think a lot of this Blue Zone is also low stress. They tend to be lower educated, and I'm not saying they're not smart, because they've got generational wisdom and they know how to look after themselves and the land. But they're low education and low, not financially well off. Then you go, how does Loma Linda fit into this? Loma Linda, it's an affluent retirees going there. I show the picture in my slides, Sarah. I show you all these beautiful places, these ancestral communities that you can see rocks and ground and bare earth. And then you get to Loma Linda and you see a 12, 15-story medical centre sitting there. Loma Linda was founded by Ellen G. White. They bought an abandoned hotel in 1905. It had been built for the railroad workers who were laying all the tracks all around California. But by the late 1890s, or even mid 1890s, it wasn't needed anymore, and it became abandoned. Two different investors had tried to make something of it because it was surrounded by orange groves and it was very pretty. It was set up on a hill, see the snow. Nope. 1905, Ellen G. White bought it for a bargain for the church and set up the church's thing. So she was having a little bit of an issue with John Harvey Kellogg at the time, thinking about 1900s. He'd been working for them for 25 years, 30 years. But he really wanted to take it down a medical side and the food and all of those things. But they wanted only Seventh-day Adventists to come to Battle Creek Sanitarium. He'd grown it to be able to have 1,200 people come and visit. He had celebrities from all over the world. They didn't like the commercial way he was taking it. And so she wanted to set up separately. But he offered them all of his recipes. He didn't charge them anything for them. He helped them set up in Australia. When she came to Australia, I didn't even know she came here. She set up sanitarium here in the 1890s. And so then she set up Loma Linda in 1905. It was a nursing training and a food industry. In 1905, they'd already set those up. By 1909, they were educating doctors as medical missionaries with this belief that animal proteins and fats were sinful, were bad. You wouldn't be translated and go to heaven. You didn't have to completely give it up straight away, but as time went on, salvation is partly dependent on it. There's other things as well. But when I was looking at Loma Linda in particular, Sarah, I just went, I've seen some very healthy. And when Dan Buettner went to Loma Linda in 2005, there were some very healthy, active, I'm not sure how many were centenarians, but certainly in their 90s, like really physically fit. Brilliant mind. It's a very close-knit community. So I'm not knocking these people either. There's some great people. But I kept thinking, how can they be so well when all the research that Gary's done and I've read about people who are vegan, that long-term, sure, if you change to become a vegan from eating a crap diet, you can see a lot of health benefits. And they can last for a while, but when you deplete your body of vitamin A, D, and K2 over time, you can't keep up that health benefit. But when I looked at the fine print in the Adventist health studies, which is what they were basing a lot of this on as well. When you look at the fine print, do you know you can be a vegan and eat meat or so animal protein or fats, fish, all of these things, you can eat them once a month and still call yourself a vegan in Adventism. It's moral gymnastics in my mind. It's like, is that enough? You can be vegetarian, and there's very few Seventh-day Adventists who are actually vegan. They call themselves vegetarian, plant-based vegetarian, but you can eat animal proteins and fats once a week and be classified as a vegetarian in these Adventist health studies. So in my mind, they're taking that to the outside world and say vegan, vegetarian. If you don't read that fine print as a health professional, you think people can be healthy, and the public, what does the public think? You can be healthy as a vegan. Vegan. They do not see the fine print where it says, but you do need some animal protein and fat at least once a month. So again, it's about transparency, Sarah. I just think the conversation needs to come from a place of transparency, a place of truth. People are allowed to make individual choices, but if that choice is being taken away by guidelines that are strict rule books, by ideology, by ethical beliefs that are impacting someone else's health, that's when I get loud. So there you go. That's me.
Thank you for getting loud, Belinda, because there is a lot that you've been uncovering, the nuances, there's the messaging, the overall messaging that's out there, the plant-based messaging, the blue zones that are largely marketed as, plant-based eating, if not entirely plant-based eating. But what you've uncovered is that that's not necessarily true. And that's where you've spoken about, well, that transparency is really important so that informed choices can be made, and that, communities or communities, they're not making decisions, that are, they're wanting to make decisions that are supportive of their health, but in actual fact, that it's not based on fact, it's based on a fabricated type of story that's coming through.
Narrative.
Yeah, a narrative, right? Exactly. So my question to you is, why do you feel as though, because you've gone through the historical aspects of where's the meat gone, okay, and brought in these, these movements, these communities, why has this largely, why has it been demonized? Yes, we've got the religious aspect, but why has so much that has, what you're uncovering, been largely shut down? And what is this agenda that's being driven, that's infiltrating so many different places and spaces?
Yeah, it's a complicated answer. You probably need hours to go through it all. I'm just going to tie up blue zones quickly first to say the Seventh-day Adventist Church have now bought the rights to the blue zones in 2020. So not only has it been promoting their messaging, but now it's owned by the church. And I found documentation saying for a city to get accredited as a blue zone, because there's, I think, over 70 cities now that are blue zone accredited in America. And I wrote to the King when I saw Dan Buttner was going to go to England to promote having city makeovers in England, and no doubt coming here because there's some high profile dietitians wanting to speak about the blue zones diet and how important blue zone communities are. I found a document from 2018 saying it was something like $6.5 million to be accredited as a blue zone. So we're talking about huge financial money. 70, and would you believe, after the church bought it, US Congress, 1,400 mayors of important cities, they had to have a certain number, so these are the biggest cities, 1,400 mayors signed up to the blue zones in 2021. So this is the church's messaging stealthily going into communities to say, we need to have more plants, we need, and they make their own foods. Like there's frozen blue zone foods. Like this is a big, big franchise. Where do I think it's come from? In my earlier research, and I haven't looked into it lately, but I will be writing more and more on my Substack. I want to reinvigorate a lot of my articles because there's some really important messages, but I put everything in them and they're too long for some people, I'm sure, and too many different topics. But if you look back, so I told you the College of Medical Evangelists was started at Loma Linda in 1909. By the 1940s, so Ellen G. White had passed away in 1915. By the 1940s, and we're talking after the Flexner Report came out that closed most homeopathic colleges in America, so allopathic, because Rockefeller had oil and he wanted medicines and he wanted band-aiding and he wanted sick care. I kept thinking, why did the College of Medical Evangelists survive? Because they weren't medicating, there was some medication, but they're really into a lot of the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church are really good. The temperance health reform, sunlight, fresh air, sleep, community. Like there's a lot of really good things. It's only the diet that is just like, whoa, like mega alarm. The diet is no animal proteins and fats. And certainly pork is unclean. Shellfish is unclean. It goes back to the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy from the Bible. But I was looking, so 1940s, there was a guy called Mervyn Harding, a devout Seventh-day Adventist researcher, professor at Loma Linda. He wanted to do a study to prove that vegetarianism was safe. Remembering vegetarianism is allowing a little bit of meat and, not pork, but allowing a little bit of meat and dairy once a week. But he called it vegetarianism. And he went to Fred Stair at Harvard University. Now, Harvard University School of Public Health, run by Fred Stair, was bankrolled by the food industry to start with. General Foods, Kellogg's. Again, just quickly, both John Harvey Kellogg and Will Keith Kellogg, who ended up owning the Kellogg's cornflakes that we know today. John Harvey Kellogg had a different brand. He had a lot of other foods, but they split. They had a nasty split. Will Keith wanted to add sugar. And so Kellogg's, not owned by the church, but I believe Will Keith and John Harvey Kellogg kept paying tithe to the church. It would have been a lot of tithe. But so Kellogg's was bankrolling Harvard. You've got a whole lot of other food industries, but in particular, sugar and processed food in there, just paying and paying to have nutrition research, this is post-war, to prove that this is not harmful. Fred Stair was being paid to do that. And then you've got Mervyn Harding coming along with the most devout religious belief that plants are the God-appointed diet for man and are our salvation. Can you believe Fred Stair when this guy's saying, I want to do my PhD study under you and prove this? Absolutely, I'm being paid by mega corporations to say plants are good. The thing they both agreed on was saturated fat was bad. So even though the Seventh-day Adventist Church don't believe a lot of sugar is good, and I'm sure Harvard had mixed feelings about how they needed to blame saturated fat so both their messages could get louder. And I truly believe when you look at this symbiotic relationship over and over and over again between the ideology and the vested interests of the food industry, by demonizing saturated fat, they can promote processed food, they can promote soy, they can promote plant milks, fiber from cereals. It's everything. And that's what I've done a lot of big articles on it, and I will do more. But yeah, that's that next intersection. And those research papers were then used in the McGovern report in 1977 to determine caps on saturated fat, and going forward, the original US dietary goals and the guidelines. A lot of people were involved from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but also people with ethical beliefs by then. We had a lot of people talking about the climate and talking about other things. But also I believe that the Seventh-day Adventist Church started with this religious purity, and masturbation really was their fundamental thing. But as it went on, they've used cancer. Red meat causes cancer. They've used other things, and they're certainly using the climate argument now, especially in the Pacific Islands. So when I first started my research, 2016, there was something like 7 prime ministers and presidents of countries in the Pacific that were Seventh-day Adventists. And the reason for that is because they've been such missionary group of people, and they go in, they offer education and take their religious beliefs in, and buy church food, because they make I think 1,004. I think there's something like 28 food industries owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church around the world that make in excess of 2,500 different products that take the place of flesh, meat, eggs, milk, and butter. in Australia, they pay no tax on any of their products because they come under the basic religious charity umbrella. So all of these conversations are coming in. And the guy who started the Australian Lifestyle Medicine Association, a guy called Gary Egger, in 2000, spoke at a World Health Organization event funded by ILSI, which is the International Life Sciences Institute, fully founded by Coca-Cola and food industry. He spoke at that event and he said, we need to use the church to get the messaging about the demonization of saturated fat, to get rid of fatty meat in the South Pacific. So there you go. It's a big story. I could talk to you all day, but I think hopefully that's given a really good overview that people can go and have a look at more of my research and find out more.
Definitely. I'm seeing in my mind's eye, there's like a mind map.
It
You know,
is. This wall
web.
behind, when Gary was being investigated, it was covered. It was like a map of where's sanitarium, where's the church, where's Coca-Cola, where's this, and they all overlap, Sarah. It is so interconnected, but unfortunately, its vested interests and religious ideology are shaping our guidelines today, and they are not about regenerative farming. They're not, unfortunately, about the health of people. It's just that's why I'm so excited when I was reading about what the Nutritional Therapy Association is doing and your background, because these are the people I want to talk to outside the medical sphere. There's only so much doctors can do within guidelines that they're being restricted by. But how do we get this messaging out to say, we need to think about what makes you healthy? What makes you healthy? What allows you to contribute to your society? What keeps, this is our close-knit group. This is our Weston A. Price ancestral group that he's founded. We might be slightly disconnected, but we are one. And the louder we can get and talk about how important the health of the soil is to be the health of the animals, to be the health of us. Like it's a circle of life. And I spoke to a beautiful girl, Kate Kavanagh, in America years ago, and this idea of the circle of life. Here in 1900s, men changed it to be linear. So linear time, what's at the end? Nothing. We fear death. We fear the end because there's nothing there. It's a void. And this is, I believe, how this idea of looking for the fountain of youth, we're chasing longevity. We're chasing us. We're chasing keeping ourselves in this space. But the blue zones, in particular, franchise, is just setting itself up to be for the elite. It's not, they're telling these roadmap, they're giving these instructions, but if you can't follow them on your own and stay healthy, which I truly believe, there's some really great things, but the diet is going to make it very hard for people, and especially people in the church, because they're encouraged to buy the church's food because it's extra tithes to the church, and they pay no tax. And if you buy Weet-Bix, you're giving a free contribution. And so you think about all these things. How do we help people take back control of their health? By looking at who decides what we eat, when we eat, and why.
Yeah, well said, Belinda. There is, I'm just sitting here and, I'm thinking about a little bit about my journey, my experiences of being in the nutrition realm, higher education. When you've talked about the many food companies, you were listing them before, General Mills or Nestle, and the list goes on. And then ILSI being a particular,
founded by
overarching.
Coca-Cola VP in 1978.
I did not know that. I know of ILSI, but I did not know of
founded
that
by
connection.
Alex Malaspina, who is the vice principal of Coca-Cola, vice president of Coca-Cola in 1978. So it was founded by ILSI. So Coca-Cola, they had tobacco industry in there. They had everybody. Coca-Cola, because I've been vocal, but not just me, other people as well. Coca-Cola pulled out, I think about 2018, 2020, so their name wasn't associated. But Sanitarium here in Australia was part of ILSI. I've got the documents to show that it was the original ILSI. There's maybe 12 or 14 companies that started ILSI here in Australia, and Sanitarium was one of them. They're not now, but they were. So this symbiotic relationship between these two entities grows because they can demonize saturated fat and grow their belief, grow their profits. I say protecting profits, as in financial, and protecting a profit. And this is the whole point. Mervyn Harding, that guy I said to you, was doing the work with Fred Stair, he said, our work is to prove, not disprove, divine inspiration. So their research is set. How can we prove that Ellen G. White was right? And they've been so involved in so much research when you start to look, and because it's not financial, they don't have to declare it. But if it's a belief system, you don't have to put that on a research paper. You can prove that plants are good or meat's bad, but it's only if you're taking money from industry you have to disclose it. So that's also very important. In America, I can tell a lot of people who are doing the research because they've trained at medical schools that are owned by the church. But in Australia, we don't have a medical school. They've only got one college, university, Avondale up in New South Wales, and they don't train doctors. So it's much harder. They don't train dietitians and they don't train doctors, but they do a master's in lifestyle medicine, and lifestyle medicine's for a whole nother day. But beware lifestyle medicine tagging as well, because that started with the church.
That started with the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Seventh-day Adventist Church, lifestyle medicine. They copyrighted that name.
Okay. All right. Wow. All right. We might need to pen that one for another chat, because that's another rabbit hole we can definitely go down, and dig deeper and understand that a little more. And so from our conversation, Belinda, today, I'm here, and I'm sure that our community at NTA Australia New Zealand will also be very much feeling this way. Is there's a lot that we're coming to learn, a lot of those connections that are certainly not overt, and that they're not there, in our face, but yet they're there, and underpinning agendas, and the continuation of those agendas, being that plant-based messaging that's coming through, and therefore how that is also underpinning industries and requirements like APRA and Dietetic Association of Australia, and
yes,
if we're talking, in our field, neck of the woods, right, in Australia. So where do you see things going from here? Do you see a continuation of these religious ideologies and place-based messaging, and
well, I don't think it's going to stop. I don't think it's going to stop because it's too important to the growth of the church and to the growth of food industry. Like, they're going to fight. And when I say fight, I think financially it's a nasty fight, but also the commercial arm of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So we're not talking about individuals who go to church and have these beliefs. I'm not talking about that level of people. I'm not saying they're bad, but the commercial arm of the church is very aware that it's making food and profiting from it. They're very aware that they've been in there designing the algorithms for the health star ratings. Like, the chief technical officer was the person who designed the algorithm for health star ratings. So we're talking about a huge influence that I believe needs to be exposed, but I think it's up to people to make a choice. And it's about individual choices to purchasing power, because that's how things change. If you go and support local farmers, if you go and support local markets, if you go and support the places that are feeding you and try to get as far away, it's not always possible. I'm not saying I'm a Puritan, but as much as possible, if we can support our local communities to produce food ethically, sustainably, and deliciously, then how much better is that? And that is the only way I think that you can start to put pressure on other things, because they're never going to stop, because they both have a very important agenda to their belief system. And I love the story of one really quick story, well, then we'll finish. Harvey Wiley, he was part of the Poison Squad. He was put into place by Rockefeller back in the 1900s to try and get rid of a lot of the additives. People were putting sawdust in sausages like that. And it wasn't just other things. So I'm saying it was meat as well, but Coca-Cola in particular. Harvey Wiley really was anti the cocaine and the caffeine in it. And he, with a lot of his studies, he felt that it was creating criminality, people getting addicted to it, as would be understandable. And he tried every level of government to have this conversation to try and block Coca-Cola, to just reduce the cocaine and the caffeine out of it, not to stop it being produced. He couldn't do that, but he wanted to set limits on what you could put into these things. And after 10 years, being blocked at one level of government because Coca-Cola was funding them back in 1910, he gave up. He walked away. And he went and worked for a women's magazine, because this is what we're doing. He went and spoke to the women who were purchasing, because at the time, the majority of women were the household purchasers. They bought the foods. They listened to hear what was healthy for their family and what wasn't. And he said he had more success working and writing articles for a women's health magazine than he ever did trying to change legislation in government. And it was because of him that, and I can't remember my numbers, we'll say 2 or 20,000, somewhere in between there, women marched on Congress, and that's how cocaine was reduced out of Coca-Cola. So people power. And by us educating people to have that confidence to say, we can make these purchases and then government may listen, because you can't change legislation and you certainly can't change a trajectory of people that are making a lot of money.
Yeah, I love that. People power.
People power.
You know, purchasing power, and
Yes.
how much power we do have individually and as communities,
Yes.
and how important this information is to come to light to support the decisions in making, those, to support us in making differing and purchase decisions if we choose so, based on that information,
Yes.
based on the truth, the facts, the factual history that's gone into what's playing out currently. And thank you so much for taking us through that where we had this really nice historical walkthrough with you today, Belinda, in a shortened version, I can imagine. Just like we've
I tried really hard to condense as much as I could. I think this is the best I've done.
Oh, you've done amazing, considering
condensing.
Yeah, condensing. You've done an amazing job at condensing this information that is there's so much there, and there's so much you've pieced together and then walked us through to give us that high level overview of what has played into what we're seeing now in terms of the plant. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, and none of this would have happened if the medical board hadn't come after my husband and tried to silence him. How crazy is that? None of it would have happened. But yes, I have walked through all of this. It was unexpected when I started this.
And, that just shows nothing happens by accident. Everything is there for a reason. Your journey with your husband and his experience of talking about reducing sugar in the diet and how helpful it can be for his patients and community as such, and how that, that was shut down, and then it opened up a whole box of information coming to light, because that was, it's been part of your journey to delve deeper and then share that with others so that we can understand further of what is actually happening, all around us, continuously, and underpinning much of what we're seeing and experiencing. So thank you for doing that. And it's been it's just been really interesting to understand at a high level, like the blue zones, and how you were saying there were so many other elements to particular areas that have been penned or highlighted as a blue zone, but there was so much more to what they're eating and how they're living than just being plant-based, because as you said, there's these little side notes. Hello, vegetarian, that can include animal protein once a week, and vegan once a month. So technically, from my understanding, that's not exactly vegetarian or vegan.
And more concerningly is that's not what the public would perceive it as. So you would have people thinking, I can be vegan and healthy because the dietary guidelines are saying it, because the Adventist health studies are saying it, and they don't know how to do it healthily and safely. And that's my concern. It's this misconception to put out messaging to say vegans can be healthy and then not explain little fine notes is just, it's not fair. So yeah.
But it is now. It is now. We're having these discussions,
Yes.
and you know, we're having this discussion. You've had this discussion with others, like you've mentioned, and I'll ask you shortly, where can our viewers and listeners find you? And you can sort of direct us in those areas in which you are writing, you're sharing this information. So if they'd like to learn more, they can go there. Before we finish up, I wanted to ask you this because we've learnt so much. You've shared so much with us. Big thank you. If there's one message you'd like our viewers and listeners to take away from today's conversation, what would it be?
I think the biggest message would be Harvey Wiley's story. It's about taking and talking to the people, and it doesn't have to just be women these days. I'm not being gender specific, but the people who are purchasing, the people who are buying, who are nourishing their families, nourishing themselves. You can make those choices, and sometimes it might seem more expensive, but our daughter did this great blog on the Australian dietary guidelines and how much it would cost to eat all the food that they said, and a low carb comparison, and that it was very similar. And you've got to remember that if you eat healthy animal proteins and fats as part of your diet, and you're not eating all that processed food and sugar that's driving more hunger and empty calories, that you'll actually be more satisfied and you won't need to be snacking and doing all the other bits. So you'll find it will even out a little bit. Gary also says if it costs a little bit more to eat better food, how much better is that than spending all that money on your medical expenses and time in his waiting room? And the cost, it's hard to see when you're in your 20s and your 30s, but as you get closer to 60s and 70s, the cost benefit is phenomenal. So I would just say to people, really think about how you can nourish yourself and support the community to be nourishing our soil, because that is more important. The climate is us. It's our environment that we live in. And I think that's what the ancestral blue zones and what Weston A. Price discovered was these people respected the soil. They respected their animals. They respected their own health. It was part of a circle of life. And if we disconnect ourselves and put bits into silos and think we've got to do this and we've got to do that, you lose, I guess, the most important messaging. And for us to be healthy and resourced for the next generation, which is a big thing that Weston A. Price talked about. And I think that is one of my hugest concerns with what's happening to the generation now and going forward, thinking Pottinger's cats and all sorts of other things. We've got to get this processed food out of our diet. And I'm not saying every single bit of it, but the majority of it. We've got to try to get back to eating healthy food, because we're destroying our health and our resourcing for future generations.
Where can our viewers and listeners connect with you and learn more about your work?
I think you just need to type Belinda Fettke into YouTube or somewhere and you'll find quite a few bits. But I'm writing a Substack at the moment. I was going to write a book. I'd actually given up everything, Sarah. I was tired. I talked. I was just not getting anywhere. You know, I've talked about all these things. I don't think I need to say anymore. And then the Netflix documentary came out in 2023, and my daughter's friends started saying, "Oh, we're going to be vegan. We're going to be vegetarian. We're going to be plant-based." I was like, "Wait a minute." So then it's only since that I've done even more about the historical points, looking into what these people really did and why they had to eat that way, and what was the cultural impact and what was the religious impact and what was the historical impact, to find out how these people all survived, and then to have this gem of finding that Ellen G. White just bought that hotel. So my story became much better. I thought, maybe I'll write a book. And then a few friends said, "Oh, it takes so long, do a Substack. Then we can start to read it now." So I started a Substack, Belinda Fettke, the Truth Zones, like the blue zones, but the Truth Zones. And I also have, yes, as you say, I support Gary website, but I haven't written a lot on there recently, but it's got if you're prepared to wade through stuff, there's a lot of really, really important information on there. And I will start to pull it apart to put onto Substack. And eventually I'm planning to do a new website, because Nina Teicholz says to me, Belinda, I can't recommend any of your I Support Gary. I love Gary articles. I can't write as a reference. I love Gary. That's the website thing. So I'm trying to set up a Belinda Fettke website, as I've lost my imposter syndrome finally, and I think it's time the research had its own little spot.
Oh, excellent. So that information there is giving us a little glimpse into upcoming projects and directions as well. And do you think eventually you will get to write that book once you've been writing your smaller articles?
I think someone else can write it. I've got grandchildren now, and I've pretty much said to Gary, I'm hoping I can get all my articles up by the end of this year, and then I'm just going to walk away. I'll leave it up there for everyone to see.
You'll leave it there, yep, as your legacy, and also to support the next person or peoples to come through and take over the reins and keep rolling with this, because there's definitely more there. But I love how you.
I didn't go to uni, so I can't do it as a master's or a PhD, and then because I haven't got those things, I can't publish it as research papers, and so they're a stumbling blocks for me. Just not that I don't have the knowledge, but in publishing it in certain ways. So I figure someone else can hopefully grab it and take it and do good things with it.
You definitely have the knowledge, and you've spent so much time gathering that knowledge and that information. So it will definitely be put to good use than we are now. Like, there's just so much there for us to just sit with. And you distilled your message to the viewers and the listeners. You distilled it right down to something, I think, quite profound, in that come back to what is wholesome, what is nourishing on multiple fronts, including our soil, our environment, our communities. There lie our answers, and we only have to look to our ancestors and the ancestral ways to see how that can work so beautifully in a most simple, very simple way. We don't have to doesn't have to be too complicated. Not at all. Health doesn't have to be complicated at all. And I think we've got ourselves into a little bit of a place where we've overcomplicated, the whole gist of it all. But thank you for sharing everything that you have, Belinda. It's been a pleasure and an honor to listen to everything. Just sit with everything that you've shared. So thank you so much. And this brings us to the end of today's conversation. We just thank you again. Just the depth of your research. It has been, truly thought-provoking. To our
thank
listeners.
You so much for inviting me. Yeah, I've really, really appreciated it, and I'm very excited for the work that you are doing as the Nutritional Therapy Association. But especially, it was really, really lovely to meet you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Belinda. Thank you. It makes our work, like when we connect with researchers like yourself, and it makes there's a community right there. You're doing your thing, we're doing our thing, but yet there is this commonality, and it's really wonderful to be able to set aside some time, make that connection, and explore these areas, and then share that with others so that they can explore if they so choose.
Yes.
So to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to today's conversation. We hope it's been, encourages you to stay curious, ask questions, and continue exploring the evolving landscape of nutrition and health, and what's coming through, what information's coming through, what's being marketed. Stay curious, ask those questions, just like Belinda, you've been doing. And if you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to share it with others and follow along for more conversations just like this, where we explore particular elements and we dig a little deeper, and we think about the differing sides to a particular area. So until next time, take care and stay well. Thank you again, Belinda.